Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you very much for finding my humble orchid channel where I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids without greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers or equipment, really just me and them inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your bag, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. My ramblings are very amateur, but it might help you figuring out your own orchid journey. And this week, somewhat of a follow-up to a minor scandal. I mean, not really, but 8 months ago in August, I went to an Orchid Society's plant sale, and it was one actually that I'd gone to speak at, which was wonderful to go and see the different members selling their wares, and a great variety of orchids it was too. So August is and this was late August, so it's the last month of winter here in Australia, so September, beginning of spring. And that is actually when all the Australian Dendrobiums start to flower, or they'll be well into spike. Depends kind of where you are and how far south you are in the relative warmth, but late winter, early spring is generally when Australian Dendrobiums flower. And at that point, I went to this fair and I bought this wonderful plant that was in bloom. And it is a cross between Dendrobium Colonial Campio and Dendrobium speciosum Windermere. So quite a bit of a complex ancestry there, which we'll get to in a minute because it is quite relevant. Anyway, at the time it was in bloom, and as you can see, there's a lot of markings on the leaves, and a lot of people were quite concerned that it might be virused. Now, when I bought it, my instinct was that in fact it's just sun damaged and maybe water damaged, which does happen to this type of Australian Dendrobium and hybrids from speciosum, kingianum, delicatum, etc. So they don't love sitting with moisture on them, and they don't love, well, they do like a lot of sun, but they do get burnt if they're in full sun. That was my conclusion. Also, that it was at an orchid fair and you would assume that all plants are vetted. So my instinct was it's just sun damage, like the best of us actually. But just to be on the safe side, when I brought it home, I put it in a corner. I put baby in the corner and kind of just forgot about it, just to keep it away from all my other Australian Dendrobium orchids. So it was in the naughty corner, but getting a lot of bright sun, I have to say, during summer, which is now over because we're in autumn. And happy as Larry it was. I repotted it almost immediately because it was in a big plastic pot, and I'll come in and show you later the roots have already started to move and grow through the medium, which is fantastic. So the first thing then is that I bought this in August of last year, and the thing I had pointed out was that I just wanted to see how the new growths, which are these ones here, went over that period of time, and if any of this sort of discoloration started to emerge on these new leaves when I was giving it more protected conditions, then there'd be cause for concern. And as you can see, these new canes are as clean as a whistle. There's no damage on the leaves, there's no marking, and nothing has happened in the 8 months since I bought it. Ergo, plant lovers, we can safely assume that this plant just perhaps hadn't been in the best conditions before I bought it. So probably it was in too much direct sunlight, and when it was being watered, it perhaps was being watered at the wrong time and got some spotting from water damage on the leaves. So I'm quite happy with that diagnosis now, despite the fact many people wrote and said, it's diseased, throw it away. Well, that's always an easy assumption to make. I think the first thing to do is isolate something and observe and just see what happens, particularly with new growth. Anyway, I'm now quite happy that this orchid is fine. But the thing is, I kind of wouldn't have taken any notice of it until spring, because it's spring when the Australian Dendrobiums and their hybrids thereof start to bloom. Well, Exhibit A, it is still autumn, plant lovers, and this plant is in full bloom. And I only noticed it because it's in the naughty corner where I don't go very often, and it, wasn't particularly focused on in terms of my care. It got watered, it got a bit of food. But then I noticed it had flower spikes a few weeks ago and thought, goodness, that's odd. And here's the great thing about the orchid community, I posted it on Instagram, and Dan, who I made a video about his amazing Sarcochias collection, which I'll link below, made the point that some of these complex Dendrobium hybrids that do have particular species in their ancestry can flower at random times, including autumn. So that led me, plant lovers, to an episode of Who Do You Think You Are or Ancestry.com, Who Are Your Long Lost Cousins? So I had a little look at the ancestry of these two crosses that created this one, and it was quite interesting. So although you would assume, and it's generally the case, that most Australian Dendrobiums, speciosum, delicatum, kingianum, and their hybrids flower in very, very late winter, early spring, there are exceptions to that rule, and here we have one, plant lovers. Let's just try and figure out why. So what I do, if you get a hybrid such as this, or a hybrid of any orchid whatsoever, if you're curious to know where it came from, well, you can find out by going to orchidroots.com, and I'll put that below. And so what I discovered is that one of these crosses, which is the Dendrobium Colonial Campio, is actually quite a complex hybrid. So I'll talk you through the ancestry of that, which gives us a bit of clues as to why this could have bloomed. Now, it could just be, which happens in the plant world, particularly now as our climate is getting more sort of unpredictable, is that some things just go crazy every now and then and bloom out of cycle and out of season and do whatever they want to do. And there's sort of no rhyme or reason to it. We haven't had a particularly hot summer, we haven't had a particularly cool summer, so I don't think there's any sort of weird climatic conditions that have occurred. And also, all of my other Australian Dendrobiums are doing exactly what they should be doing at this point, which is nothing. So why this baby should have decided to spring forth would suggest perhaps it's not climatic, but it is something to do with its DNA and some of those species in the background. So let's have a look. Okay, so the first cross we'll look at is Dendrobium speciosum Windermere. Now, that, from what I can gather, is really just a variety of Dendrobium speciosum, but everything I've read about Windermere says it is a great seed origin for hybridization. So obviously the flowers are large and of a great color, and it's a very reliable and floriferous plant. And Dendrobium speciosum, I'll drop in the footage of mine. They're just the most extraordinary sight when they're in full sail. So that's that, nothing too complex there. But this one, Dendrobium Colonial Campio, now that is a little bit of a complex fish. So it has in its ancestry Dendrobium speciosum, which you'd imagine, Dendrobium kingianum, which you'd also imagine, and looking at those flowers and the form, it's very Dendrobium kingianum-like, although kingianums are much smaller, and this is a massive plant. That's probably about 80 centimeters tall, so like 1.5 foot tall from the top of the bot to the top of the spike, quite large. The other plant in its ancestry is a plant from the further north of the country called Dendrobium bigibbon. A common name for that is the Cooktown orchid, and that is a very large magenta, almost phalaenopsis-like Dendrobium flower. Quite famous, and it's been hybridized a lot, I think available all around the world. It's quite a flashy, quite a showy orchid, but quite a different shape flower to most of the other Dendrobiums that are native to Australia. And the other ancestor of this is Dendrobium tetragonum, which I'd never heard of. And that is again an orchid that grows along the coast of the eastern seaboard of Australia. And it is more pendulous, very epiphytic and pendulous. It tends to grow down, and the flowers are slightly more distended and look a little bit like those orchids from, say, New Guinea, which have the sort of twisted sepals. Quite different. Anyway, but those two, the last two species ancestors, bigibbon and tetragonum, do reveal some clues as to why this might be in bloom now. Okay, plant lovers, it is time to consult the Bible of Australian Orchids. Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols. This is an amazing book. All the illustrations were painted in the sort of 40s and 50s. It was published, I think, in the 50s, and this is obviously a reprint. A fantastic book if you're interested. Really hard to find though. I miraculously found it in a secondhand shop, which one of the greatest finds of my life, because orchid books are expensive. Anyway, let's see what the Bible of Australian Orchids says about Dendrobium bigibbon. So that's the one with the large magenta flowers. Looks more like a sort of Phalaenopsis dendrobium than the more sort of kingianum shaped flower that we're more familiar with. Flowering period. Almost continuous from January to November. Now that is basically midsummer all the way through to summer again. Basically the whole of the cooler period of time. So from midsummer, autumn, winter, spring, early summer. And plant lovers, we are now in autumn here in Australia. I know some people like to make the point that it's not autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. Well, it is in the Southern Hemisphere. So Dendrobium tetragonum is commonly called the tree spider orchid and is a very attractive and graceful species that is common in many coastal scrubs, and the flowering period is May to September depending upon the latitude and altitude. Well, plant lovers, I'm filming this at the very end of April. So there we go. So thank you, Dan, for the suggestion that if Dendrobium, Australian Dendrobium hybrid has got a couple of the more tropical species in its ancestry that tend to have different flowering times, you can get one that will bloom basically as we're doing now in autumn. And yet last year it bloomed in spring. So that is interesting. Of course, the question might be, will it bloom again in spring? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But at the moment, it surprised me so delightedly with flowers now because there's not a huge amount in bloom at the moment. I mean, there are some things. In fact, all the Miltonias are in bloom. It's autumn, but certainly nothing Australian. So it's a thrill to see this. So while we're here, we may as well just have a quick look at the care and conditions. Now, I've made many a video about Australian Dendrobiums, and I've got a playlist, in fact. In a nutshell, free draining mix, surprise, surprise. Now, sometimes Dendrobium speciosum, for example, which is one of the ancestors of this, the nickname or the common name is Sydney rock orchid, which gives you a sense that it can be lithophytic as well as epiphytic. So basically, you've got crevices in rock faces which fill with material, and the plant can get a sort of a foothold in there, but again, quite contained, because obviously that rock's not going to expand. So it's like being in a small pot. So they can thrive in those conditions, but you can also find them growing on stumps and in parts of trees, the forks or boles of trees as well. Same with kingianum, the other ancestor of this, and tetragonum, the other ancestor of this, very much epiphytic. So I think the figure is like 70% of the world's orchids are epiphytic. So basically you always need to give it a free draining mix. Now, actually, I very recently made a repotting video with a Dendrobium speciosum hybrid, I presume, that I found at my favorite nursery that was untagged and at half price. And in that video, I revealed my shameful secret that with Australian orchids, so Australian Dendrobiums and Sarcochilus, I use an out-of-the-bag orchid mix from a hardware store, which is cheap and very easy to find. And it is a little bit more grainy than just the bark that you would perhaps normally use for orchids. But again, I think, you know, be creative. If you imagine that nook where these plants are growing, either in a rock surface or in the bole of a tree or an old stump, lots of material gathers there. There will be grit, there will be decayed leaf matter, etc., etc. So yeah, it just seems logical. Anyway, I've always planted mine in that medium and they all flourish. So it's very easy for me to do. That's the medium. And I will just come in and show you that you can already see that I repotted this, 8 months ago, and the roots during the warmest period really started to grow and spread across the surface of that medium and started to find their way in. So in terms of the potting, of course, I use terracotta just because I find it more attractive. It's also a bit more sustainable than plastic. Black plastic is not recyclable, unfortunately, which most plant pots are made from. And it drains freely, allows the moisture in the medium to evaporate quite quickly, which is good in winter, particularly when you don't want the roots of a plant to be soggy, and perhaps not so good in summer because it does mean the pot dries out quite quickly. So in summer, if you're using terracotta or in warm weather, you do have to really focus on the watering to make sure that your plant isn't too dry. These plants, though, I'm here to tell you, are fairly tough. They can take quite long periods of dry, and I tend not to water mine specifically, actually, because most of them are out in the elements under trees, but they do get rained on, so I kind of just leave it to that. In summer, if we haven't had rain, I will water them, but occasionally they're quite drought tolerant, because most Australian plants need to be, because no matter where they are, the rainfall can often be unpredictable. So they often go through dry and wet cycles, not sort of like a monsoonal cycle, such as they need a dry winter, but they just can take those drying, wetting cycles. I would say, though, in pot culture, just let it dry out quite a lot before you water it very well each time. And what I did when I repotted it was put in some slow release fertilizer, and I just use a general all-purpose flowering plant fertilizer in the medium. And every spring I do a topical application of that same fertilizer with all of my plants. I'll put the link here to my "What fertilizer do you use?" video. I also put in a little dash of mycorrhizal fungi powder, which you can get online from just about anywhere. Wherever you are in the world, just Google mycorrhizal fungi and you'll find reviews of products that are available to you. I'll put the link of the one I use, but it's not a recommendation. I mean, it's all much of a muchness. Just see what you can find locally. So mycorrhizal fungi are the fungi that live in soil, and what they do is break down the organic matter and release such things as moisture and nutrients, and they make it available to the roots of all plants. The plants then give the mycorrhizal fungi energy from photosynthesis, which the mycorrhizal fungi can't do. So it's very symbiotic. And orchids, in fact, need mycorrhizal fungi to germinate their seeds because they have no protein in the seed. It's incredible. The seed lands somewhere, the mycorrhizal fungi finds it, gives it the food and energy to germinate. Bob's your uncle, off we go. All plants need a mycorrhizal fungi relationship, and you can't hurt the plant by adding more of it. The worst you could do is nothing. So I always add it to my potting mixes, always. Although there's probably already going to be some in there just from the manufacturing process of the way that the compost is broken down, even commercially, to produce potting mix in a bag. And then, you know, if I feel like it, but often not with my Australian Dendrobiums, I do then liquid fertilize them through the warmer periods. Dilute that down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 of whatever it is you're giving. And sometimes that's a liquid fertilizer, which could be orchid specific or just flowering plant specific, a general plant fertilizer. And sometimes I use a tonic, a product here called Sea Sol, which is seaweed based, not sea salt, but seaweed, or something from a worm farm. You often get a liquid that runs out of worm farms. You can use that as a dilute as well. Fantastic tonic for plants. However, as I said, they do tend to just have to fend for themselves. Back to the earlier point though about sun damage, I generally try and give mine a lot of sun in winter, so as much direct sunlight as you can give them, particularly in the morning and early part of the day. A little bit of protection in the afternoon if the sun is quite hot, because you will get leaf damage, and some of these spots are definitely from sunburn. However, you can see Dendrobium speciosum growing in full sun. Looks terrible. They look so bleached and yellow and burnt, but they will flower like there's no tomorrow. So you've got to find that midpoint between keeping your foliage looking good and enabling the plant to get enough light to bloom well. Under a tree, dappled light where it gets morning and perhaps midday sun, and then afternoon protection if you're in a climate that doesn't get too cold in winter, is perfect. But they do like that cooler, brighter condition in winter. And plant lovers, the other thing I've done, which I never do, but I did it for you, is I've staked these flowers so you could actually see them. Now often, Dendrobium delicatum, which I have, which is a natural hybrid between speciosum and kingianum, has the most delicious fragrance. Dendrobium kingianum does as well, and speciosum, and tetragonum, one of the ancestors of this, does have a fragrance, but I have to say this one doesn't. It's quite an overcast day though, so the sun hasn't shone today, so maybe the flower just hasn't been triggered to release its fragrance. But I have been giving it a good sniff every day and I really can't detect a fragrance, so maybe it's just skipped it. And often the fragrance gene is not passed on. It's often something that does get dropped off in the hybridization process. Anyway, this doesn't have a scent. But the reason I bought this, and I have a lot of Australian orchids, so I don't need any. Of course, what do we need other than food, shelter, warmth and love? I decided I needed this because the flowers are massive. Look at the size of that. They're also a really beautiful color. So they're sort of magenta from a lemon striped center. Really, really beautiful. But for me, it was the size of the bloom and the color, and it leapt out at me at the fair. And I'm really, really thrilled I bought it. The flowers are quite evenly distributed across the spike. Now, a Dendrobium speciosum is densely packed with flowers and it looks very different. This has more of the flowering habit of kingianum, delicatum. It's just that it's much bigger. So the spikes are longer, the distance between the flowers is bigger, and the flowers themselves are bigger. So it's a real showstopper. And it's got two spikes. It's got a spike that I hadn't noticed was sort of under aphid attack because it was in the naughty corner and I wasn't paying attention. It had another spike that just withered, I think for the same reason, naughty corner, no attention. And there is a new spike or another spike just emerging on this cane here, which I'll show you. So 1, 2, 3, 4 that didn't emerge, and 5 spikes, which is great. So basically every cane with a leaf should bloom, and sometimes they can have multiple racemes from each cane, and they will bloom again from each cane. So you know, some orchids will never bloom again from the point that they flowered from. Australian Dendrobiums will. So don't be tempted to cut your Dendrobium canes if you think it's flowered once or you think it's looking a little unhealthy. Just leave it, because it can still bloom, even the ones with no leaves. So the other thing about damaged leaves is that you're going to have to look at them for a long time, because these leaves will last for years and the canes will live for years, keep blooming for you. Every spring you should get at least a couple of new growths coming up once the plant starts to get established. So you really quite quickly get quite a large plant, and each of those canes will bloom with at least one spike, sometimes more. So in the blooming season, if it's a good year, you can have an amazing looking plant. So don't cut anything off. But obviously those canes are going to mature and die, senesce, as they say. So what will happen, the first thing that will happen is the leaves will probably turn yellow and drop off. You're then left with the canes, which you can see here on this one, which are nude, but still green. So they're still full of life and giving energy to the plant. So I wouldn't trim those until that cane actually starts to dry out and desiccate. And you will see that it's sort of brown and shrunken and really doesn't look alive. That, plant lovers, is when you could trim your canes. I mean, the other time you could, if you were going to split this to create a couple of different divisions, then I would, like with this plant, for example, I would try and split it right down the middle so that you had some canes that were leafless and some canes that had leaves, and then each of those plants would prosper. But if you were splitting it, you could perhaps ditch the canes that were leafless if you wanted to. Now, I'm not going to split mine because I want it to be a huge specimen plant covered in flowers. So there we are, plant lovers. The mystery, perhaps of not, of Dendrobium Colonial Campio crossed with speciosum Windermere in bloom in autumn in Australia. Thank you, Dan, for your suggestion that it could be one of the species ancestors that's triggered blooming at this point in the year. I think you're right. But a very happy sight it is too. A big plant, and now that I know perhaps that it can bloom at this point of the year, I will focus a little bit more on its care. The other great thing is I think that whatever damage had occurred to it was environmental, not sinister, as it has not transferred to any of the new growths. So I am feeling quite confident that this is a healthy plant and it can now join its cousins in the sunny corner, not the naughty corner of the garden. So thank you, plant lovers. Thank you for watching. Thanks for finding me in the crowded world of orchid videos here on YouTube. If there is anything to report further on this orchid, I will. I'll be very curious to see what it does or doesn't do in spring when all of its cousins should be in bloom. But there you are. It's a fantastic exercise in who's your cousin, Ancestry.com, finding out why perhaps your plant is doing what it's doing. So it's always interesting just to have a little look at a hybrid to see where it came from in terms of its species and which traits it's brought through. As I said though, this did bloom in spring last year, so who knows? Maybe it's just having a strange moment. Anyway, whatever it is, I'm very happy it's bloomed, and I'm very happy that you are succeeding with your orchids wherever you are. Good luck with those. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for finding me, and I look very much forward to seeing you next week with another orchidy adventure. So until then, take care.